Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we're looking at the unbelievable true story of how our modern interconnected world actually began. Now, when we think of massive historical empires, we usually picture the British, the Romans, or maybe the Mongols. But today, we're exploring a story of discovery, extortion, immense wealth, and devastating human cost, all authored by a totally unlikely player. So, how did an impoverished kingdom of barely 1 million people end up conquering the globe? Well, long before Britain ruled the oceans, a small kingdom of barely 1 million people built the world's first global empire, changing trade, exploration, and history forever. It is the ultimate David versus Goliath narrative. A tiny, overlooked nation just sitting right there on the edge of the world, deciding they were going to literally redraw the map of the planet. So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. An unlikely maritime power. 2. Pushing the final frontier. 3. The passage to India. 4. Forging a global network. And 5. The fall of an empire. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1. An unlikely maritime power, the edge of Europe. Okay, I want you to imagine being stuck on the extreme, impoverished periphery of late 14th century Europe. To your east, you are totally blocked by a hostile neighbor, Castile. To your west, well, you're staring out at the menacing Atlantic Ocean, which, by the way, Arab mapmakers terrifyingly refer to as the Green Sea of Darkness. Meanwhile, Italian city-states, places like Venice and Genoa, they were making an absolute fortune, right? They held a massive monopoly on the Oriental spice trade. So if Portugal wanted to survive, let alone thrive, they had to find a way around those middlemen. They literally had to look to the ocean. And that brings us to the caravel. Prince Henry the Navigator's pursuit of this specific ship design unlocked the entire ocean. It was a total game changer. Notice those triangular Latin sails? For the very first time, a ship could actually sail against the wind in a zigzag pattern. It was originally based on a fishing vessel, so it had this shallow draft that was perfect for exploring coastal rivers. But the true genius was in those sails, because it meant sailors could head out into the terrifying, totally unknown open ocean and actually have a reliable way to safely get back home. Section 2. Pushing the final frontier, inch by inch down Africa. Now, this wasn't some sudden, glorious sprint. No, it was an agonizingly slow crawl down the West African coast. It all started back in 1415 with the capture of Ceuta in North Africa, and it took them until 1434 just to pass Cape Bojador, which was this huge psychological obstacle. People literally thought it was the point of no return, where the sea would boil. Year by year, headland by headland, they inched forward, planting these stone pillars called pedrados, mapping the continent, always looking for gold and spices. It took over 70 years of incredibly cautious exploration just to reach the bottom of the African continent in 1488. And the sheer audacity of Bartholomeu Dias's voyage to get there is just unbelievable. His ships were hit by a massive storm and blown way off the coast. But instead of fighting it, Dias made this blind, totally counterintuitive leap right into the void of the westerly ocean. For 30 terrifying days, they saw absolutely no land. Temperatures were plummeting, supplies were dwindling, morale was bottoming out. But when they finally spotted the coast and headed east, they realized the coastline was actually turning north. They had successfully rounded the tip of Africa. The passage to the Indian Ocean was officially open. Which leads us to Section 3, the passage to India, Vasco da Gama's gamble. 12,000 miles. That is the mind-boggling scale of the journey Vasco da Gama undertook in 1497. Da Gama basically took Dias's oceanic leap of faith and just magnified it. He sailed in this huge, looping curve way out into the deep Atlantic just to catch the right winds. His men spent an astounding 93 straight days without seeing a single piece of land. They battled violent storms, near mutiny, and a horrific outbreak of scurvy, like we're talking men's gums rotting right over their teeth. But against all odds, after 309 grueling days at sea, they finally spotted the mountains of India. But upon arrival in 1498, there was a massive culture clash. Da Gama stumbled into Calicut, India, which was this highly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy, cosmopolitan trade hub. And it honestly made the battered, filthy Europeans look like a bunch of impoverished pirates. Da Gama completely misunderstood Hinduism. He actually thought the locals were just a strange sect of Christians. And he deeply insulted the local king, the Zamarin, by offering up these incredibly cheap trinkets like honey, oil, and hats, instead of gold. Tensions boiled over into hostage-taking and bombardment, and Da Gama's fleet barely managed to escape a massive 70-ship ambush sent by the enraged Zamarin. It was a totally chaotic, violent introduction, but they made it back to Lisbon with spices that sold for an absolute fortune. Moving right along to Section 4, forging a global network, the spice daddy of Europe. So, to build the economic engine of this brand new empire, Portugal rapidly set up fortified trading outposts across 3 different continents. From West Africa, they extracted gold, ivory, and enslaved people. From the Indian Ocean and places like Macau in Asia, they funneled back incredibly valuable spices, silks, porcelain, and gems. And over in Brazil, a massive plantation and mining economy generated absolute fortunes in sugar, Brazil wood, and gold. Now, to control all of this, the Portuguese didn't actually conquer vast inland territories. They just didn't have the manpower for that. Instead, they captured highly strategic coastal choke points. We're talking places like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz. Then, they established naval supremacy, using heavily armed galleons to enforce something called the Cartaz. This was essentially a mandatory maritime protection racket. Any merchant ship operating in the Indian Ocean had to buy a Portuguese license and pay taxes at Portuguese ports. If they didn't, their ship would be seized or just blown straight out of the water. However, it's absolutely vital that we balance the awe of their exploration with the devastating human cost of this economic engine: 4 million. As Portugal established massive sugar plantations in places like Brazil, they turned to the African continent for forced labor. It's estimated that over the lifespan of the empire, Portuguese ships transported 4 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. That accounts for nearly 40% of the entire transatlantic slave trade. This brutal commerce deeply enriched the empire, but it irrevocably altered the demographics and economies of multiple continents. As historian Roger Crowley so perfectly points out, unlike Columbus, the Portuguese hadn't just burst into silent seas. For thousands of years, the Indian Ocean had been the crossroads of the world's trade. Portugal was a tiny, aggressive force trying to forcefully monopolize a massive, ancient, and highly complex global system. Trying to maintain control of this sprawling network across vast distances with such a tiny population, it was a logistical nightmare. It required constant warfare, and frankly, it just couldn't last forever. Which brings us to Section 5, the fall of an empire, hubris and overextension. The empire's monopoly eventually unraveled in a rapid cascade of disasters. In 1578, the young King Sebastian died in battle in North Africa without an heir, throwing the entire kingdom into chaos. This crisis allowed Philip II of Spain to step in and seize the Portuguese throne in 1580, kicking off the Iberian Union. And by being officially attached to Spain, Portugal suddenly inherited all of Spain's extremely costly wars. By the 1600s, well-funded, highly nimble Dutch and British joint stock corporations were systematically attacking and violently seizing Portugal's most lucrative trade routes and strongholds. Now, Portugal did eventually regain its independence, and they pivoted to rely heavily on the immense gold wealth coming out of Brazil. But then, nature dealt a horrific blow. On a single morning in 1755, a catastrophic earthquake, a massive tsunami, and huge fires completely obliterated the capital city of Lisbon. The disaster wiped out unimaginable wealth, it crushed their merchant fleets, and destroyed centuries of precious historical archives in a single day. The empire was essentially crippled from the center out. From there, it was a long, slow, multi-century unraveling. Their crown jewel, Brazil, officially declared independence in 1822. Fast forward to the 1970s, and a series of bitter conflicts led to the post-World War II collapse of their African colonies. Finally, in December of 1999, the very last piece of the empire, Macau, was handed over to China, officially ending the global empire. And that brings us to our final thought. If a tiny kingdom could redraw the map of the world in a single century, whose map are we living on today? The Portuguese Empire is gone, but the globalized, interconnected world economy they effectively invented through daring exploration, relentless trade, and brutal exploitation, that remains the very foundation of the modern world. Their sea routes still carry global commerce, and over 250 million people today still speak their language. It really makes you wonder, looking at the map we navigate today, which invisible historical forces are still shaping our reality. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.